It was a Wednesday when the static first came. I was sitting on the couch, half watching a documentary about deep-sea creatures, when the TV flickered. The screen went black for half a second, then buzzed back to life, but the channel was different. It was an old cartoon, a black and white animation of a rabbit in a hat, dancing across an empty stage. The picture was grainy, the kind of thing that looked like it had been dug out of a dusty film reel. I flipped the remote to change the channel, but the screen froze. The rabbit turned to face me. There was something off about its smile. Too wide, too sharp. The animation stuttered as it tilted its head, as though it were struggling to move. Then the screen went dark again. I sat there for a moment, staring at my reflection in the black glass. When the TV came back, it was back on the documentary, the narrator calmly describing bioluminescent jellyfish. I turned it off. That night, I dreamed about the rabbit. It stood in the corner of a room I didn't recognize, its head too large for its thin, angular body. The eyes weren't cartoonish anymore. They were small and human, blinking in slow, deliberate movements. When I woke, the room felt colder than it should. I shook it off as a trick of the mind, the result of too much caffeine and a restless night. But the static wasn't done with me. The next day, my radio glitched. I had it on while I was cooking, the low hum of a jazz station filling the kitchen. Then the music cut out, replaced by the same static I'd heard on the TV. It buzzed, low and faint, before a voice slipped through. It wasn't the smooth tone of a radio DJ. This voice was slow and broken, like words being stitched together from fragments of sentences. "Are you still watching?" I turned the radio off so quickly I almost knocked it off the counter. By the time the weekend came, the static had started appearing in other places. The hallway light flickered whenever I walked beneath it, casting shadows that shifted unnaturally. My phone screen would freeze for seconds at a time, the battery draining faster than it should. And then there were the mirrors. At first, it was subtle, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye when I brushed my teeth, a shadow behind me when there was no one else in the apartment. But one night, as I passed the mirror in the hallway, I saw something I couldn't explain. The reflection wasn't mine. It looked like me, same hair, same clothes, but its movements were slightly out of sync. Its head tilted to the side when I wasn't moving, and its eyes followed me even when I turned away. I covered the mirror with an old sheet, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. The static came back louder the next day. I was in the middle of a video call for work when the screen froze. For a moment, my face was replaced by the rabbit's. Not the cartoon version, but the one from my dream. Its eyes blinked slowly, and its mouth opened just enough to show rows of jagged, uneven teeth. The call disconnected. When I looked down at my hands, I saw thin black smudges on my fingertips. The static followed me everywhere after that. It was in the whir of my laptop's fan, the hum of the fridge, the faint crackle of my earbuds. It layered itself over everything, turning the mundane into something oppressive. I started hearing whispers at night, faint and fragmented, like someone speaking just out of reach. Keep watching. The rabbit appeared more often, sometimes in reflections, sometimes in the corner of the room, just on the edge of my vision. It never moved, never spoke, but I could feel it waiting. One night, the TV turned on by itself. The screen glowed faintly, the static buzzing louder than ever. The rabbit was back, standing in the middle of an empty road. The scene was grayscale, the edges of the screen warped and flickering. "Come closer," the voice said, but the rabbit's mouth didn't move. I tried to unplug the TV, but the cord wouldn't budge. The rabbit turned its head toward me, its smile stretching impossibly wide. The voice came again, louder this time. "Keep watching." The lights in the apartment dimmed, and the static grew deafening. When I blinked, I wasn't in the apartment anymore. I was on the road. The rabbit stood a few feet away, its body towering over me now, thin and angular like it had been stretched too far. The smile was gone, replaced by an expression I couldn't read. It lifted a hand, if you could call it that, and pointed behind me. When I turned, I saw myself. I was standing in my living room, staring at the TV, my face slack and expressionless. The static buzzed around me, louder than ever, but I didn't move. The rabbit's voice came one last time, low and clear. "You're part of the show now." The world flickered, and then there was nothing but static. The envelope was made of black vellum, its surface smooth and cool against my fingers. It had no address, no stamp, just my name written in gold ink across the front. I found it tucked under the windshield wiper of my car one morning as I left for work. Inside was a single card, blank except for 3 words written in the same gilded hand. "You missed something." The words felt sharp, deliberate, their meaning just out of reach. I turned the card over, hoping for more, but the back was bare. The envelope smelled faintly of cedarwood and something metallic, like old coins. When I showed it to him that evening, he frowned, his brow furrowing deeply. "Probably some marketing stunt," he said, handing it back to me without a second glance. "For what?" I asked. "I don't know. A puzzle, maybe?" He shrugged and turned his attention back to the sink, where he was rinsing a glass. "You always get worked up over little things." The dismissal stung more than I wanted to admit. The next morning, as I left for work, I checked the car again. Another envelope was waiting on the passenger seat. This time the card inside read, "Not where you think." I spent the day replaying the words in my mind, their cryptic nature gnawing at me. When I got home, he was in the living room, flipping through a magazine. The envelopes and their strange messages didn't seem to bother him at all. "You're really hung up on this," he said when I brought it up again. "Maybe it's just someone playing a prank. Don't let it get to you." But something about his tone felt off. Too casual, too quick. He'd always been good at smoothing over things, but now the edges were showing. The third envelope appeared on Thursday, slipped under the front door. This card was different. Instead of the cryptic phrases, it held a date and a time. Friday, 10 p.m. When I showed him, he barely glanced at it. "Don't go," he said, his voice flat. "Why not?" "It's probably some creep trying to lure you somewhere." "I'll be careful," I said, but he grabbed the card from my hand, crumpling it before I could protest. "Forget about it," he said firmly. That night, I lay awake long after he'd fallen asleep, my mind buzzing with unanswered questions. The next evening, I waited until he left for his usual Friday night poker game before slipping out of the house. The card's instructions led me to an old clock tower downtown, its face glowing dimly against the dark sky. I parked a block away, my nerves fraying as I approached the door. It was unlocked, swinging open with a faint creak. Inside, the air smelled of damp stone and rust, and a narrow staircase spiraled upward into shadows. I climbed carefully, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty space. At the top, the room was empty except for a table in the center. On it sat a single envelope. I opened it with trembling hands. "You're so close." I turned, scanning the room for any sign of movement, but it was silent. That's when I noticed a faint glimmer in the corner, a flash of light reflecting off a piece of metal. I stepped closer and found a small key lying on the floor, attached to a thin silver chain. It felt warm in my hand, almost alive. When I got home, he was waiting for me. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice tight. I held up the key. "What's this for?" His face went pale, his usual composure slipping for the first time in years. "Where did you get that?" "At the clock tower," I said. "Why does it matter?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stood and walked to the window, his back to me. "You shouldn't have gone," he said quietly. "Tell me what this is about." He turned, his expression a mixture of frustration and something I couldn't name. "Fear, maybe." "It's nothing. Just forget it." But the way he avoided my gaze told me everything. The key didn't fit any lock in the house, and for days, its purpose haunted me. Then, one night, I caught him leaving the house with a small bag slung over his shoulder. I waited a moment before following him, my heart pounding as I trailed his car through the empty streets. He drove to a storage facility on the outskirts of town, stopping at one of the farthest units. I watched from a distance as he unlocked the door, disappearing inside. After a few minutes, he came back out, empty-handed. When he was gone, I approached the unit, the key burning in my pocket. The lock clicked open easily, and I stepped inside. The space was dimly lit, filled with strange, mismatched items, a wooden box, stacks of faded photographs, and a large trunk with metal edges. Inside the trunk was something I didn't expect: letters. Hundreds of them, tied with ribbons and labeled with dates. The handwriting was his. I opened the first one, my hands shaking. "You'll know the truth soon." The second, "It wasn't supposed to be this way." The rest were unreadable, their words smudged as though they'd been written in haste. But one thing was clear: they weren't meant for me. I locked the unit and drove home, the weight of the discovery pressing against my chest. When I walked in, he was waiting in the kitchen, his eyes scanning my face. "You followed me," he said, his voice quiet. "I know," I replied. "Now tell me who they're for." He stared at me for a long time before answering. "They're for you," he said finally. "But not yet." "What does that mean?" "It means there are things I can't explain. Not now." The vagueness of his words was infuriating, but I knew pushing wouldn't get me the answers I wanted. That night, I tucked the key into a drawer and tried to sleep, though my dreams were filled with letters, envelopes, and shadows that stretched farther than I could reach. I never got the full story. Maybe I never will. But sometimes, the things left unsaid tell you all you need to know. The light in my studio was wrong, but I didn't notice until the painting began to hum. I'd been working on it for weeks, an abstract mess of blues and blacks, streaked with sharp lines of gold. It was supposed to evoke movement, a sense of endlessness, though I didn't have a clear vision of what it should become. That was the beauty of abstract art. You didn't have to know where you were going. The hum started faintly, like a distant vibration, almost imperceptible beneath the scratch of my brush on canvas. I assumed it was the pipes or the neighbor's stereo, shrugged it off, and kept painting. But by the second night, it grew louder. It wasn't mechanical, nothing so simple. The sound was alive, rich and layered, shifting in tone as though it were following a rhythm I couldn't hear. And then the light changed. It wasn't the flickering of a bulb or the intrusion of headlights from the street. It was the light itself. The harsh fluorescent glow softened, deepened, and took on a strange warmth that didn't belong in my cramped apartment. Shadows stretched in unfamiliar ways, warping and bending across the floor as if they had a mind of their own. I stepped back from the canvas, and for the first time, I felt like it was looking at me. The blues had deepened to the color of storm clouds, roiling and dark, while the gold lines shimmered faintly, as though catching light from somewhere unseen. The shapes seemed to twist subtly, their edges shifting when I wasn't watching. I told myself it was exhaustion. Too many late nights hunched over the easel, too much coffee, not enough sleep. I turned off the light, closed the door, and left the painting alone. But the next morning, it was different. The lines were sharper, more defined, and new shapes had appeared. Concentric circles radiating outward, their centers impossibly black. I hadn't painted them. I knew I hadn't. I should have thrown it away. Instead, I kept painting. The hum became a presence in the room, a weight that pressed against my chest as I worked. The shapes grew stranger, more intricate, until the canvas seemed less like art and more like a map. It wasn't abstract anymore. It was something deliberate. By the third week, the painting was alive. I don't mean that figuratively. Its surface pulsed faintly, the colors shifting and swirling like liquid trapped beneath glass. The gold lines glowed softly, and the black circles at its center seemed to draw the room inward, warping the air around them. And then the handprints appeared. They were faint at first, smudges of light at the edges of the canvas. But each time I turned away, they multiplied, growing clearer, sharper, until it was undeniable. They were mine. The night it opened, I woke to the sound of wind. My apartment had no drafts, no windows left ajar, but the air was alive with movement, a low howl that seemed to come from the studio. The painting glowed faintly in the dark, its gold lines flickering like embers. The black circles at its center had deepened into voids, their edges sharp and impossible, as though the canvas had been cut open. And there, just beyond the surface, was a figure. It moved slowly, its shape indistinct, a shadow without a source. I watched, frozen, as it pressed against the edge of the canvas, its hand pushing through the paint as though it were water. When its fingers touched the air, the hum stopped. The silence was deafening, a weight that filled the room and pressed against my skull. The figure stepped out of the painting, its movements fluid and deliberate, and for the first time, I felt true fear. It wasn't human. Not exactly. Its shape was close. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, but its proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, its joints bending in ways that defied logic. Its surface shimmered, dark and iridescent, like oil on water. It turned toward me, and though it had no face, I knew it was looking. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there. But the room felt heavy, the air thick and unmoving. The figure raised one hand, its fingers long and sharp, and pointed at the painting. I turned to look. The canvas was no longer a canvas. It was a window. Through it, I saw a landscape that didn't belong to this world. Twisting spires of black stone, a sky churning with golden clouds, and rivers of light that flowed upward instead of down. The figure stepped closer, its hand brushing against my shoulder. The touch was cold, not in temperature, but in essence, as though it carried the weight of something vast and incomprehensible. "You made this," it said. The voice was soft, layered, 100 whispers folding into one. "I didn't mean to," I managed to say. The figure tilted its head, the motion unsettling in its precision. "It doesn't matter." It stepped past me, toward the window, and as it moved, the edges of the room began to blur. The light from the painting grew brighter, the hum returning with a sharp intensity that filled every corner. The figure stopped at the edge of the window, its form silhouetted against the golden sky beyond. "Will you follow?" it asked, its voice barely audible above the rising hum. I didn't answer. The figure stepped through the window, its shape dissolving into the swirling colors of the other world. The painting flared brightly, then dimmed, the hum fading into silence. When I looked again, the canvas was empty. Not blank, empty. The surface was gone, replaced by a void so complete it hurt to look at. I burned it the next morning, but sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, I still hear the hum. I found the house by accident, tucked away at the end of a road that shouldn't have existed. It wasn't on any map, not even the satellite view. I had been driving aimlessly after a fight with my sister. Something petty and stupid I couldn't even remember now, letting the quiet hum of the car soothe my nerves. I took turns without thinking, veering down side streets and winding lanes, until I reached the forest at the edge of town. That's where the road appeared. I swear it hadn't been there before. One moment, I was on the edge of the woods, staring at a dead end, and the next, the asphalt stretched out in front of me, perfectly straight and unnaturally smooth. I hesitated, my instincts prickling, but curiosity won out. The road was flanked by dense trees, their branches arching overhead like a tunnel. The further I drove, the darker it grew, the daylight swallowed by the canopy. My headlights barely pierced the gloom, casting sharp shadows that seemed to ripple as I passed. And then, without warning, the house came into view. It stood at the end of the road, its silhouette stark against the twilight sky. The architecture was strange, Victorian, but wrong somehow, its proportions stretched and skewed. The windows were too narrow, the angles too sharp, the roof steep enough to look impossible. I pulled over, my hands tightening on the wheel. The air felt thick, heavy with an electric charge, and the forest around me was silent. Not quiet, silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of the wind. My gut told me to leave, but then the front door opened. It didn't creak or swing. It simply opened, as if waiting for me to notice. From where I sat, I couldn't see inside, just a rectangle of darkness yawning against the pale wood. I should have driven away. Instead, I got out of the car. The gravel crunched beneath my feet as I approached the house, the sound startlingly loud in the stillness. The closer I got, the stranger it looked. The wood of the exterior seemed to shift, the grain twisting and bending, as though the house were breathing. When I reached the porch, the air grew colder, a damp chill that made my skin prickle. I peered through the open door, half expecting someone to appear, but the interior was empty. Or so I thought. The entryway was long and narrow, lined with old wallpaper that peeled at the edges. At the far end was another door, slightly ajar, a faint glow spilling out from the gap. I don't know why I stepped inside. The floorboards groaned under my weight, the sound echoing down the hallway. The door behind me swung shut with a quiet click, and the faint glow ahead seemed to pulse, drawing me forward. The second door opened as I approached, revealing a room unlike any I'd ever seen. It was vast, impossibly so, its walls stretching out into an infinite distance. The ceiling arched high above, disappearing into darkness, and the floor was made of polished black stone that reflected the faint light. And in the center of the room stood a chair. It was simple, wooden, the kind of chair you'd find at a kitchen table. It looked absurd in the massive space, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. I stepped closer, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud. There was something on the chair, a book, thick and bound in cracked leather. The cover was blank, but as I reached for it, a single word appeared, etched into the surface. Open. I hesitated, my hand hovering above it. The air around me felt alive, buzzing faintly, and I could hear something just at the edge of my hearing. A soft hum, rhythmic and insistent. Against my better judgment, I opened the book. The pages were blank. At first, I thought it was a trick, but as I turned the pages, words began to appear, scrawling themselves in jagged black ink. The handwriting was chaotic, shifting and writhing, but I could still read it. You are here because you chose to be. The words faded, replaced by new ones. You cannot leave until you finish. The hum grew louder, vibrating in my bones, and the walls of the room began to ripple, as if they were made of liquid. The book's pages turned on their own, faster and faster, the words spilling out in a language I couldn't understand. The hum became a roar, deafening, and the chair beneath me began to sink. I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't move. The chair sank further, pulling me down with it, the floor swallowing us both like quicksand. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the book. Its cover had changed, the word open replaced with read. I don't know how long I was gone. When I woke, I was back in my car, the forest around me silent and still. The road was gone, replaced by the dead end I'd seen before. But the book was in the passenger seat. I tried to leave it behind. I threw it into the woods, left it on the side of the road, even burned it once. It always comes back, waiting for me when I wake. The pages are no longer blank. They're filled with entries written in my handwriting, chronicling things I haven't done yet. And every night, the last page changes. It always says the same thing. Go back. When I bought the house, the realtor never mentioned the attic. It wasn't in the listing photos, and during the walkthrough, she carefully avoided the small, painted-over hatch in the ceiling of the upstairs hallway. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Old houses often came with quirks. I was too enamored by the place itself, its wide bay windows, the creaking hardwood floors, the overgrown garden that begged to be brought back to life. The attic could wait. For the first few weeks, life in the house was peaceful. I spent my evenings unpacking boxes, stripping decades of paint from the baseboards, and falling asleep to the sound of the wind rattling the loose panes in the kitchen. But one night, while painting the guest room, I heard something above me. It was faint, barely more than a whisper of movement, but unmistakable. A soft creak of wood, like someone shifting their weight on old beams. I froze, paintbrush in hand, and tilted my head to listen. Nothing, just the wind, I told myself. Houses this old had a way of talking back. But then it happened again, louder this time. A slow, deliberate groan of footsteps directly above me. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the hallway. The hatch was there, a small square of wood flush with the ceiling, its edges painted shut. The sound had stopped, leaving the air around me heavy and still. For a moment, I considered leaving it alone, calling a friend, a neighbor, maybe even the police. But there was something about the silence that drew me in, like the house itself was holding its breath. I found a step stool and a screwdriver. It took longer than I expected to pry the hatch open. The layers of paint peeled away reluctantly, cracking like dry skin as I worked the edges loose. Finally, with one last twist, the hatch gave, swinging downward to reveal a narrow ladder leading into darkness. The smell hit me first. It wasn't rot or mildew, as I'd expected, but something faintly sweet, like dried flowers mixed with old paper. I climbed up slowly, the flashlight in one hand, the ladder creaking beneath my weight. The attic was smaller than I'd imagined, the sloped ceiling forcing me to crouch. The beam of light swept across the space, revealing insulation, a few broken floorboards, and something else. A trunk. It sat in the far corner, half buried under a pile of yellowed newspapers. Its surface was scuffed and battered, its leather straps cracked with age. I knelt beside it, my fingers brushing against the cold metal clasp. It wasn't locked. Inside were three things: a bundle of letters tied with twine, a small wooden box, and a photograph. The photograph was old, black and white, its edges curling. It showed a young woman standing in front of a house that looked eerily similar to mine. She was smiling, her hand raised in a wave, but her eyes were wrong. I set the photo aside and picked up the letters. The handwriting was delicate and looping, the ink faded to a soft gray. Most were dated from the 1920s, addressed to someone named Eleanor. They started out sweet, full of affection and promises to return soon. But as I read further, the tone changed. The later letters were frantic, scrawled in uneven lines that bled into each other. "You have to stop. I can't do this anymore. It's watching me, Eleanor. Even now." The final letter ended abruptly. The ink smudged as though the writer's hand had been dragged across the page. I stared at the empty space where the words should have been, my chest tight. The wooden box was small, barely the size of a paperback. Its lid was carved with an intricate design, a spiral that seemed to twist and shift the longer I looked at it. When I opened it, I expected to find trinkets, jewelry, or maybe more letters. Instead, there was a single object, a key. It was old, its surface tarnished, and its shape was strange, not like any key I'd ever seen. Before I could examine it further, the flashlight flickered. The attic was suddenly darker, the shadows pressing in. The air felt heavier, thicker, like the room had grown smaller. And then I heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere behind me. "Eleanor." I spun around, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, a cold weight pressing against my shoulders. I scrambled down the ladder, nearly dropping the flashlight in my haste. I slammed the hatch shut and pushed a heavy chair beneath it, as though that would make a difference. That night, I locked the key, the letters, and the photograph in a drawer. But the whispering didn't stop. It started faint, just on the edge of hearing, growing louder as the nights passed. Sometimes, I'd wake to the sound of footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate. Other times, I'd hear my name, soft and drawn out, like a breath against my ear. And always the scent of dried flowers. 2 nights ago, I woke to find the photograph on my bedside table. The woman's smile seemed sharper, her eyes darker. The key was lying beside it. I don't know what's in the house or what it wants, but I know it won't stop until I open the door. The library basement was off limits. A small brass sign on the door made that clear: archives, staff only. Though Calla had worked at the library for nearly 2 years, she'd never gone down there. No one had ever asked her to, and frankly, she was glad for it. The stories were enough to keep her away. Patrons whispered about it, especially the older ones who remembered the library from their childhood. Strange noises, unusual cold spots. One woman even claimed she'd seen lights flickering under the door late at night, long after the library had closed. Calla had rolled her eyes at most of it, small-town gossip and overactive imaginations. But now, standing alone in the quiet reading room with a ringing phone in her hand, she felt less certain. The call had been strange. A man, his voice low and flat, asking for something from the archives. "You need to come get it," he'd said. Calla had explained that she didn't have access. She wasn't allowed down there. But the man insisted. "It's there for you, waiting." Before she could argue, the line went dead. She should have left it alone. She told herself it wasn't her problem, that it could wait until her manager came in tomorrow. But the way the man had spoken, the certainty in his voice, gnawed at her. She found herself standing in front of the door to the basement anyway, her keycard clutched tightly in her hand. The lock clicked open with ease. The air beyond was colder, carrying a faint smell of old paper and damp stone. A set of narrow stairs descended into darkness, the light from the main floor barely stretching into the void below. Calla hesitated, the weight of the phone call pressing on her chest. "Just look," she muttered to herself. "Just take a peek and go." The stairs creaked under her weight, the sound too loud in the stillness. She half expected the lights to flicker when she reached the bottom, but they didn't. The basement was illuminated by faint, overhead bulbs that cast a pale yellow glow across rows of metal shelves. The space was massive, larger than the main floor of the library, though that shouldn't have been possible. Boxes were stacked neatly on every surface, labeled in faded handwriting that was too small to read from a distance. Everything about the room felt wrong, like stepping into a dream where the edges didn't quite hold together. She wandered deeper, her footsteps soft against the concrete. The air grew colder the farther she went, and the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed to fade. Then she saw it. At the center of the room, tucked between two towering shelves, was a small wooden table. On it sat a book, bound in dark leather and unervingly pristine compared to the dusty chaos around it. The title was embossed in gold, written in a language she didn't recognize, the letters sharp and angular. Calla approached slowly, her pulse quickening. Something about the book drew her, a pull she couldn't explain. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cover. The hum of the lights vanished. The basement was silent now, so quiet it pressed against her ears. The book grew warm under her touch, the leather soft and faintly pulsing, as though it were alive. Her hands moved on their own, opening it to the first page. The text inside was written in the same angular script, but as she stared at it, the letters began to shift, rearranging themselves into words she could understand. The first key is choice. The second is consequence. The third waits below. A low sound, like the groan of wood under pressure, echoed through the room. Calla snapped the book shut, her heart hammering. The air felt heavier now, the shadows around her darker, stretching too far. She turned back toward the stairs, but they were gone. "No," she whispered, spinning in place. The shelves loomed taller than before, their edges curving inward as though the room were folding in on itself. The voice came from everywhere at once, deep and resonant, vibrating through her chest. "Do you seek what lies beyond?" "No," she shouted, backing away. The book in her hands grew heavier, the warmth turning to heat, the edges of the leather faintly glowing. The voice came again, softer this time, more insistent. "The key is yours. Open it." Calla wanted to drop it, to throw it and run, but her fingers wouldn't let go. The book's weight pressed against her palms, its pull undeniable. She opened it again. This time, the page wasn't blank. An image had appeared, a door, carved from black stone, its surface etched with the same sharp script. Beneath it was a single line of text. "The door waits only for you." The room shifted. The shelves fell away, dissolving into shadow, until only the table and the book remained. Ahead of her, where the stairs had once been, the door from the image stood solid and real. Calla stared at it, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The pull was stronger now, dragging her toward it step by step. The air around her buzzed faintly, like static before a storm. She reached the door, her hand brushing its cool, smooth surface. "Do you choose to enter?" the voice asked. She didn't respond. The door opened on its own. Beyond was nothing. Not darkness, not light, just a vast emptiness that seemed to stretch forever. But within it, something moved. It was slow, deliberate, its form too massive to comprehend, its edges flickering like the beginning of a fire. The book in her hands vanished. The voice spoke one final time, soft and hollow, as though it were retreating into the void. Welcome home." The door swung shut behind her, and in the basement of the library, the air stilled once more. I first noticed him on a rainy Tuesday afternoon at a little neighborhood cafe I'd frequented since moving into the area. I was curled up in a corner with my laptop when I glanced up and saw a man in a dark coat and a slightly crumpled hat sitting at a table near the window. At first, it seemed like an ordinary scene, just another patron waiting for his coffee to cool. But something in his steady, unwavering gaze made me feel oddly observed. I dismissed it as a fleeting sensation and returned to my work, thinking little of it. Over the next few days, I began to see him again, always in the most unexpected places. One evening, as I was leaving the grocery store, I caught a glimpse of him near the produce section, his eyes fixed on a display of apples. I hesitated, thinking perhaps it was a coincidence, but the timing was uncanny. He was there, exactly as I passed through the aisles. His presence was never overtly menacing, just quietly persistent. I tried to rationalize it as chance encounters, but an uneasy feeling had already taken root in me. A week later, on my usual walk in the park to clear my head, I saw him sitting on a bench beneath a large oak tree. He looked up as I passed by, nodding in a slow, deliberate manner. I quickened my pace, heart pounding, and told myself that maybe I was simply overreacting. After all, he wasn't doing anything overtly harmful, just existing silently in the background. Yet the sensation of being tracked and watched clung to me like a cold sweat. Then came the subtle changes in his behavior. One afternoon, while waiting at a bus stop, he struck up a conversation. "Nice day, isn't it?" he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I answered politely, but he continued, asking questions about my day, my work, and even my hobbies. His voice was calm and friendly, but every word seemed calculated, as if he were trying to gather pieces of my life like a puzzle. I felt my stomach twist in anxiety and made a hasty excuse to leave before the conversation could delve any deeper. The incidents began to escalate. I started noticing small, inexplicable signs that he had been near me even when I wasn't aware. My keys would be slightly out of place. A book I had left on my kitchen counter would be rearranged on my shelf in a manner that wasn't mine. And once I even found a note on my doorstep that simply read, "I see you." The handwriting was neat, almost too familiar, but I never managed to trace its source. Each discovery left me more unsettled, as though someone, or something, was orchestrating these occurrences with an unsettling precision. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie awake in bed, eyes scanning the dark corners of my room, feeling as if I were under constant surveillance. Every creak and whisper in the night sent me into a spiral of thoughts. Was it just my imagination, or was that man following me even in the quiet moments? I began to avoid my usual routes and altered my routine, but no matter how much I tried to evade him, he always seemed to appear, like a ghost slipping through the cracks of my carefully constructed life. One particularly disconcerting moment came when I was at work. I was sitting at my desk, trying to focus on a report, when I noticed him reflected in the window of the adjacent building. He was standing there, staring directly at me. I couldn't see his face clearly, but the intent in his eyes was unmistakable. I felt a cold rush of panic as I realized that every effort to maintain my privacy was being undermined by this silent observer. I checked the security cameras and, sure enough, caught a fleeting glimpse of him just outside the frame, as if he were monitoring my every move. Desperation set in. I started documenting every encounter in a journal, detailing the dates, times, and locations of each sighting. I scoured social media and local community boards, hoping to find a clue or connect with someone who had experienced something similar. To my astonishment, I discovered scattered accounts of strange encounters. A neighbor mentioning a man in a dark coat seen near her home, another recounting an odd conversation at a bus stop. The stories were inconsistent in details, but shared that unnerving undercurrent, the feeling of being watched by someone who shouldn't be there. The more I uncovered, the more isolated I felt. I confided in a close friend about the unsettling pattern, and while she tried to reassure me that it was all a series of coincidences, her eyes betrayed a hint of concern. I could see that my growing paranoia was affecting not only my peace of mind, but also my interactions with others. I began to feel as though I were slipping into someone else's plan, a plan in which I was an unwitting pawn in an elaborate, obsessive game. Tonight, as I sit in the dim light of my living room, my heart still races with every shadow that dances on the wall. I glance at the clock, wondering if I'll ever feel safe again. I can't shake the feeling that this man is not just a random passerby, but a calculated presence in my life, weaving his way into every corner of my existence. Is it merely coincidence that he appears in places I frequent, or is he intentionally seeking me out? Am I simply overreacting to a series of unfortunate events, or am I truly being stalked by someone whose motives remain a dark mystery? I have no answers, only the persistent, gnawing anxiety that perhaps, somewhere in the shadows, he's watching me even now. It began with the small things, minor discrepancies that I could easily chalk up to fatigue or a wandering mind. At first, I noticed that everyday items seemed to vanish without explanation. My favorite mug, a chipped porcelain piece I'd owned for years, would be missing for hours, only to reappear in an entirely different spot than where I'd left it. I assumed I had misplaced it or forgotten where I'd put it, but a creeping unease settled in my stomach every time it happened. Then, seemingly trivial changes emerged in my surroundings. One evening, after a long day at work, I returned home and discovered that the clock on the wall, which had always been steadfast, now displayed a time that was inexplicably off by several minutes. At first, I blamed it on a dead battery or a power surge, but soon I realized it was not an isolated incident. Over the next few weeks, the phenomenon grew bolder. I began to notice faint, unfamiliar markings on surfaces in my apartment. A series of scratch-like lines on the wooden doorframe, a circular smudge on the kitchen table that I couldn't remember ever seeing before. It was as if something or someone had been there, deliberately leaving traces behind. I cleaned them off, only to find them reappearing the next day, darker and more defined. I mentioned it to my roommate, Mark, hoping he might share in my concern, but he dismissed my worries with a laugh, insisting that I was just overthinking things. "It's probably just the wear and tear of old wood," he said, though his eyes flickered with uncertainty for just a moment. One night, as I lay in bed trying to force sleep, I heard a soft thumping sound from somewhere in the apartment. It was not loud enough to rouse me fully, but it was steady, almost rhythmic, and it sent a chill down my spine. I sat up in the darkness and listened intently, straining to catch the sound. It seemed to be coming from the hallway, a place I had always considered safe and familiar. I mustered the courage to get up and investigate, only to find the corridor empty and silent. The thumping had stopped, leaving me with a lingering sense of dread. I retraced my steps back to my room, unable to shake the feeling that something was off. The changes weren't confined to inanimate objects. I soon began to notice that the people around me were acting differently too. Friends I'd known for years would say things that contradicted what I remembered, as if parts of our shared history had been subtly rewritten. At a recent dinner party, a close friend casually mentioned an event that I was sure had never happened, an inside joke we'd all laughed about once, but which now seemed foreign. When I pressed him for details, he only shrugged, as if the conversation was perfectly ordinary. The more I tried to discuss these inconsistencies, the more others brushed them aside, suggesting that perhaps I was just imagining things. Yet the evidence was all around me. I decided to document every anomaly, writing down times when objects disappeared, noting the changes in my home, and recording conversations that seemed to deviate from reality. My journal quickly filled with accounts of subtle shifts, like the way the pattern on my living room rug seemed slightly altered, or how a painting I'd always admired now looked as if its subject was staring at me with a new, unsettling intensity. I took photos, compared them over time, and even set up a small camera in the hallway, hoping to capture something that could explain it all. But every review of the footage left me with nothing but more questions. The camera recorded only static and occasional flickers of movement that vanished before I could identify them. Then, one evening, the disturbances escalated in a way that left me shaken to the core. I was alone in my apartment, the silence around me oppressive, when I noticed the temperature dropping suddenly. My breath became visible, and an icy chill seeped into my bones. In the reflection of the darkened window, I thought I saw a figure standing behind me, a shadowy presence that didn't belong. I spun around, heart hammering, but the room was empty. The lights flickered, and for a split second, everything seemed to distort, as if reality itself was bending. I couldn't tell if it was a trick of my mind or something else entirely. Desperation drove me to seek help. I reached out to a couple of close friends, recounting every detail, every odd occurrence. They listened politely, but remained skeptical, attributing the incidents to stress or my imagination running wild. I even consulted a professional who suggested that I might be suffering from severe sleep deprivation and anxiety. But deep down, I knew this was not the whole truth. The pattern was too consistent, the anomalies too precise to be mere figments of a troubled mind. Now, as I write these words, I feel an ever-present weight in my chest, a fear that what I'm experiencing is part of something larger and far more disturbing than a simple case of misremembered moments or random coincidences. Every day, I wake up wondering if the world I knew has been subtly rewritten without my consent, if each small change is a deliberate alteration made by an unseen force. I've become convinced that I'm being drawn into a narrative that isn't mine, a story where the familiar has turned alien, and where every comforting routine hides a sinister secret. I've tried to find a logical explanation, to piece together the puzzle of disappearing objects, altered memories, and eerie reappearances, but each answer only deepens the mystery. The feeling that I'm being watched, that my very surroundings are orchestrating these changes to trap me in an ever-shifting reality, will not leave me. Even now, as I sit in the dim light of my living room with the shadows dancing on the walls, I can't help but wonder, am I simply misinterpreting a series of coincidences, or is there something far more malevolent at work? A force that is bending my world to its will? I fear I may never find the answers. And until then, I remain trapped in a place that looks normal to everyone else, yet feels completely alien and hostile to me. I moved into the apartment on Linden Street on a gray November morning, the kind of day where the sky seems permanently overcast and everything feels muted. It was an older building, one of those relics with creaky floors and stained wallpaper, but it had an inexplicable charm that drew me in. The first few days were uneventful. I spent them unpacking, arranging my modest belongings, and slowly learning the quirks of the place. Like the way the elevator groaned as it ascended or the friendly nods from Mrs. Holloway, the kindly old neighbor who always greeted me in the hallway. Everything felt ordinary, even comforting in its predictability. Then, almost imperceptibly, small things began to change. One evening, as I was settling in with a book, I glanced up from my reading and noticed that the framed photograph of my family, which had hung on the living room wall since I moved in, was now tilted at an odd angle. I assumed I must have knocked it while passing by and adjusted it absent-mindedly. But that same night, I found a different anomaly, a single, dark smudge on the otherwise pristine hardwood floor where no one had walked. I cleaned it up, chalking it up to a stray mark or maybe the damp weather. The next week, things took on an even stranger tone. I encountered a man on the street, someone I was sure I'd never seen before, standing under a flickering street lamp outside the building. He gave me a brief nod, a gesture so ordinary that it could easily have been a passing courtesy, yet his eyes held an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I later asked Mrs. Holloway if she'd seen him, but she just shook her head and insisted that she only recognized familiar faces around here. I began to wonder if I was overreacting, if my imagination was running wild after a long, lonely day at work. At first, the oddities were confined to my apartment. My keys would sometimes be missing from the bowl by the door, only to reappear on my kitchen counter, as if moved by an unseen hand. I found a stray note on my doormat one morning, written in a neat, unfamiliar script that simply read, "Don't forget." I asked the building manager if anyone else had reported similar happenings, but he dismissed it as pranks by local kids. Still, a nagging feeling of unease settled over me, a quiet, persistent whisper that something wasn't right. Then the changes began to ripple outwards. At work, I started noticing that colleagues behaved in subtly different ways. A friend I'd always joked with began avoiding eye contact and speaking in clipped, terse sentences. During a routine conversation at lunch, he mentioned an incident that I was sure we'd never discussed, a bizarre story about a broken watch and a lost day that I couldn't place. I later recalled that the day before, I'd felt as if time itself had slipped away, hours where nothing happened, as if I had been absent from my own life. I tried to rationalize it, blaming fatigue or distraction, but the feeling persisted like a slowly tightening noose. One night, I returned home later than usual from a late shift. The hallway was eerily silent, and the familiar hum of the building's heating system felt strangely distorted. As I fumbled with my keys, I caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection of a darkened window, a fleeting figure standing just outside, its face obscured by shadows. I spun around, half expecting to see the stranger from the street, but there was nothing there. I felt as if I were being watched, as if some unseen presence was silently recording my every move. The sensation was unnerving, more unsettling than any physical threat. I began documenting these experiences in a journal, hoping to find a logical explanation. I noted every detail: the tilt of the photograph, the misplaced keys, the fleeting glimpse of a stranger. And yet, when I tried to share my entries with friends or even Mrs. Holloway, they smiled politely and told me I must be stressed or overthinking things. "Everything's normal," they said. "You're just tired." But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Each time I looked around, the familiar surroundings felt subtly different, as if the world I had known was being rewritten before my eyes. One particularly disconcerting evening, I sat in my living room, staring at the clock as it ticked steadily. I felt an overwhelming compulsion to check every corner of the apartment, as if I were expecting something to reveal itself. In the kitchen, I found the back door slightly ajar, though I was certain I had locked it before leaving. In the bedroom, the mirror reflected not only my tired face, but something moving just behind me, a fleeting silhouette that vanished the moment I turned. Panic surged through me, but when I called out, no one answered. The cumulative effect of these events left me reeling. I was no longer convinced that these were isolated coincidences or the product of an overactive imagination. They were too deliberate, too methodical. It felt as if I were caught in a closed loop where the very fabric of my reality was being tampered with by forces beyond comprehension. My memories began to blur. Conversations from the previous day seemed to have been altered, as if someone had edited my recollections. I wondered if I was losing my mind or if something far more sinister was at play. Now, as I write these words in the dim glow of my bedside lamp, I am haunted by the chilling certainty that my world is not what it appears. The building, the people, even my own actions seem to shift ever so slightly when I am not looking. I feel isolated in a reality that everyone else insists is perfectly normal. I've come to believe that these inexplicable changes are not random acts of fate, but part of a larger, darker force that I cannot escape. No one will believe me, and perhaps they don't need to. They continue with their lives, oblivious to the subtle rewrites of our shared reality. I don't know if I'll ever find answers. What I do know is that I no longer feel safe in the world I once trusted. The ordinary has become dangerous, and every familiar corner of my life now harbors a sense of foreboding. I am left with a lingering, inescapable question. Is this just a series of coincidences born from a stressed mind? Or is there something profoundly darker controlling the changes? Something that will never let me go back to the reality I once knew? And in that haunting uncertainty, I lie awake at night, wondering if I'm the only one who sees the cracks in this carefully constructed illusion, or if I'm merely the latest victim in a world where nothing is ever truly as it seems. I never thought a simple weekend retreat would unravel the fabric of reality I once took for granted. The farmhouse, hidden behind gnarled trees and shrouded in a perpetual mist, seemed to possess a consciousness of its own. I arrived late on a dreary Friday night, the last bus delivering me to this forsaken part of the country. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the sinister history of the place, recounting stories of disappearances, inexplicable sounds, and restless spirits that roamed the property. Their warnings, though dismissed as superstitious nonsense by many, began to haunt me from the moment I stepped onto the creaking wooden porch. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay and damp earth. I took refuge in a small, sparsely furnished room that reeked of mildew and old smoke. As night deepened, I tried to convince myself that the eerie silence was merely a byproduct of isolation, but that illusion shattered when, at the stroke of midnight, a persistent, rhythmic tapping stirred me from uneasy sleep. At first, I assumed the sound was simply the wind rattling against the window panes, yet its intensity grew steadily, emanating from the corridor outside my door. With trembling resolve, I ventured into the dark hallway, where a solitary, flickering bulb cast long, distorted shadows on peeling walls. Every step echoed ominously as the tapping abruptly ceased, leaving behind a silence so profound it pressed against my eardrums. Drawn by an inexplicable compulsion, I entered a study lined with dusty shelves bearing ancient tomes. In the center of the room lay a collection of faded photographs, sepia images of the farmhouse in its prime, capturing families whose smiles masked an undercurrent of sorrow. One portrait in particular sent a chill down my spine. A spectral figure standing in the doorway, its features blurred yet unmistakably human, mirroring the solitary man I had glimpsed earlier that night. Scratches and claw marks marred the wooden table, as if someone had desperately tried to ward off an unseen force. Sleep became a stranger in the following nights, replaced by vivid nightmares that blurred the line between waking and dreaming. In one recurring vision, I stood before an ancient mirror only to see my reflection morph into a void of black eyes that beckoned me into an abyss. Each morning, I awoke drenched in sweat to find subtle alterations in the room. Like the mirror hanging askew, its surface briefly revealing images of haunting figures before returning to normal. The farmhouse itself seemed alive with malevolence. Doors I had securely closed would be found ajar, and inexplicable footprints, as though left by an entity defying human form, trailed across dust-laden floors. Desperation drove me to document every anomaly, yet each recorded detail only deepened the enigma. One fog-laden evening, I ventured into the overgrown garden behind the house. Amid tangled hedges, I discovered a crumbling stone tablet inscribed with cryptic symbols and archaic phrases. As my fingers traced the cold, worn surface, the temperature plummeted and a spectral figure emerged, a woman draped in tattered garments, her eyes brimming with sorrow. With a trembling gesture, she pointed toward the farmhouse before vanishing like a wisp of smoke. That encounter shattered my last vestige of rationality. In a hidden room behind a false wall, I uncovered remnants of bizarre rituals, scattered candles, dried herbs, and cryptic symbols etched into the floor. At the room's center lay a small, sealed chest. Against every instinct, I opened it, unleashing an intense cold and a low, guttural murmur that seeped into my mind like poison. The contents, a collection of aged letters in an unknown script, fragments of a diary recounting eldritch rites, and an antique key pulsing with an eerie light, hinted at a malevolence far older than I could comprehend. In the days that followed, the boundaries between the tangible and the spectral dissolved. Shadows began to move with a will of their own, and the soft tapping returned, now accompanied by faint whispers calling my name. Attempts to leave the farmhouse proved futile. The roads twisted back upon themselves, ensnared by a mysterious fog that defied escape. I now record these events as both a confession and a warning, though each word feels drenched in uncertainty and dread. I cannot discern if I have awakened a dormant evil or merely stumbled upon a tragic relic of a haunted past. The antique key, the cryptic letters, and the spectral visitors all point to an ancient force that lurks in the darkness, waiting patiently to claim its next victim. Now, as endless twilight engulfs this cursed abode, I sit before a battered desk with trembling hands, compelled to chronicle my descent into madness. The nights are punctuated by unseen footsteps and voices that murmur in languages lost to time, each sound unraveling a fragment of a puzzle I fear I shall never solve. Time has lost all meaning here, as waking hours merge indistinguishably with fevered dreams. Every creak and every rustle in the shadows serves as a reminder that I am not alone. Something ancient stirs within these walls, its intentions as inscrutable as the swirling mists outside my window. The key I found and the diaries I uncovered hint at rituals performed long ago. Rituals that may have torn the veil between our world and one of unspeakable terror. I write these words with a heavy heart, uncertain if they will ever reach another soul, or if they will vanish, like so many others, into the void. The farmhouse remains an enigma, a repository of sorrow and dark secrets, and I fear that my ordeal is merely the prologue to a horror that stretches beyond mortal comprehension. The whispering dark surrounds me, the silent void sings my name, the endless night echoes with secrets. The whispering dark surrounds me, the silent void sings my name, the endless night echoes with secrets. The whispering dark surrounds me, the silent void sings my name, the endless night echoes with secrets. I moved into the modest apartment on Elmwood Avenue, expecting nothing more than a fresh start. At first, the changes seemed insignificant. A misplaced coffee mug here, a turned-over cushion there. Nothing more than the quirks of an old building and my own forgetfulness. But slowly, these small oddities began to accumulate into a pattern I couldn't simply ignore. It started innocently enough. On my third evening, I returned from work to find my living room rearranged. The couch faced a different direction, and a framed photo I distinctly remembered hanging on the wall was now propped up against the bookshelf. I chalked it up to my own absent-mindedness, or perhaps a simple prank from a neighbor. Yet when I mentioned it in passing to a friend, he assured me that no one had been near my door. I tried to convince myself that fatigue was blurring my perception. Within a week, the unexplained incidents grew bolder. While walking home under the streetlights one rainy night, I caught sight of a man in a dark coat who smiled at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. A mixture of sorrow and something else, something unsettling. His features seemed achingly familiar, yet I was certain I had never met him before. I questioned my memory and dismissed the encounter as a trick of the rain and my overactive imagination. Then came the sounds. Late at night, as I lay in bed struggling to sleep, I began to hear faint murmurs and whispers echoing from the hallways. The voices were soft and almost comforting at times, yet they carried an undercurrent of melancholy that made my skin crawl. I even recorded these moments on my phone, only to find the recordings filled with an indistinguishable static and occasional, barely audible snippets of what might have been words. Listening to them, I felt both reassured by their familiarity and disturbed by their inexplicable presence. I started keeping a journal, meticulously noting every anomaly. Objects in my apartment began disappearing and reappearing in places I distinctly remembered leaving them. A book that once sat on my coffee table would be found on the windowsill the next morning. A pair of keys that I thought I had lost would be discovered in the refrigerator. I began to feel that my home was playing tricks on me, orchestrating these moments as if it were alive. When I mentioned these occurrences to my neighbors, they exchanged uneasy glances and dismissed my concerns as stress-induced hallucinations. But deep down, I couldn't shake the nagging sensation that there was something more at work. One crisp autumn evening, I returned from a long day at work to find a series of handwritten notes stuck to my front door. The messages were brief, single words like remember, look, and stay, scrawled in a style that resembled my own handwriting, though I was positive I hadn't written them. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that not only were these strange events happening, but they were also beginning to communicate with me. That night, I awoke to the soft sound of humming, a tune I recognized from my childhood, one that my mother used to sing. I followed the sound through the dimly lit corridors, only to find an empty hallway and an inexplicable feeling of being observed. As days turned into weeks, I found my grasp on reality slipping. At work, I caught fleeting glimpses of a figure standing in the background during meetings, a person whose eyes seemed to reflect a profound sadness, yet who vanished as soon as I tried to focus on them. My phone would buzz with notifications of messages from unknown numbers containing cryptic symbols and incomplete sentences. The more I searched for logical explanations, the deeper I sank into uncertainty. Was it possible that my mind was betraying me, conjuring these scenarios as a result of isolation and stress? In a desperate bid for answers, I installed a camera in the main hallway of my building. I reviewed the footage night after night, hoping to find evidence of an intruder or some rational cause behind the inexplicable rearrangements of my furniture. Instead, I saw only fleeting moments, a flash of a pale face, a shadow that lingered too long, and then nothing. The more I examined the recordings, the more I began to doubt my own sanity. Were these images real, or had I edited them into my memory to cope with the overwhelming sense of dread? Now, as I sit in the dim light of my living room, every sound and shadow seems laden with meaning. I can't be sure if the events that plague me are manifestations of a fractured mind or if something unseen is orchestrating them. Each day, the line between reality and delusion blurs further, leaving me to wonder if I'm the unwitting participant in a game I never agreed to play. The voices, the familiar strangers, the misplaced objects, all of them whisper a single, unsettling question. Am I truly losing my grip on reality? Or is there something out there, watching and waiting for me to notice? I continue to document these occurrences, not knowing if I'm building evidence of a hidden truth or merely chronicling the unraveling of my own mind. Every unanswered note and every fleeting figure only deepens the mystery. As I write, I can't help but question, was any of this real, or is it all just a figment of my imagination, a waking nightmare with no escape? I moved into my small apartment on the third floor of an aging building in early November, excited for a fresh start after years of renting cramped spaces. At first, everything seemed perfectly normal. Boxes neatly piled in the living room, my favorite mug resting on the table, the old bookshelf arranged just as I had left it. But within a week, I began to notice subtle changes that I couldn't explain. One evening, after a long day at work, I returned to find the patterned rug by the door slightly askew. I remembered leaving it perfectly centered, yet there it was shifted a few inches to the left. I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness and straightened it out, but an uneasy feeling lingered. The following day, as I was making coffee, I noticed a faint smudge on the kitchen counter, a smudge that resembled a handprint, though I was certain no one had been there. I wiped it clean, thinking it was a trick of my tired eyes. Over the next several days, small items began to disappear and reappear in places I didn't recall moving them. My keys, usually in their designated bowl, were sometimes found on the windowsill. A book I had been reading one night would be resting on the coffee table the next morning, open to a page I had not left it on. I started to wonder if I was simply losing my mind, but the consistency of these occurrences gnawed at me. I tried to discuss the odd happenings with my neighbor, Mrs. Delgado, a kind older woman who lived across the hall. "Maybe you're just imagining things," she said with a sympathetic smile when I mentioned the misplaced keys. "Things tend to settle differently in old buildings." But her reassurance did little to quiet the growing anxiety in my chest. Every time I turned away, I felt as though unseen eyes were watching, scrutinizing every detail of my home. One night, while lying in bed, I heard a soft rustling in the living room. The sound was so faint I wasn't sure if it was a draft or something else. Gathering my courage, I crept into the living room with the lights off, expecting to find nothing. In the pale glow of the streetlight filtering through the window, I saw that my favorite painting, one I hung on the wall the day I moved in, was now slightly crooked, its frame askew by just a degree. I straightened it and returned to bed, but sleep eluded me. My mind buzzed with the question, were these mere coincidences, or was something more sinister at play? The disturbances escalated slowly. One morning, I awoke to discover that the digital clock on my nightstand was displaying the wrong time, a minute or two off from what I'd set it to the night before. I reset it, assuming a power fluctuation had caused the error. But later, while reviewing a journal entry on my phone, I saw a photo of my living room that I didn't remember taking. In the picture, An odd shadow was cast across the wall near the bookshelf, a shadow that wasn't there when I'd checked before. I began to wonder if someone had been in my apartment without my knowledge. I installed a small camera to record overnight, desperate for answers. When I reviewed the footage the next morning, I saw nothing out of the ordinary, until a frame froze on a blurry figure standing by the doorway. The figure was indistinct, like a wisp of smoke or a trick of the light, but it sent a chill down my spine. I tried showing the video to a friend, but he dismissed it as a camera malfunction, insisting that the image was too distorted to be taken seriously. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. Then came the marks. Faint scratches appeared on the baseboard in the living room, as if something had clawed along it during the night. One day, I found a handwritten note on the kitchen counter, scrawled in a hurried, almost desperate script. "It's not just you." I stared at the message, heart pounding, but when I asked around, no one else claimed to have seen anything. I contacted the building manager, who shrugged it off as graffiti left by a transient, though he couldn't recall any incidents of that sort before. Each small anomaly began to merge into a larger, disturbing pattern. I started to feel as though my home was not static, but shifting imperceptibly when I wasn't looking. Furniture would appear to be in one place when I left, only to be in a slightly different position when I returned. I began to document every odd occurrence in a journal. Yet each time I reviewed my entries, some pages were inexplicably missing or the details had been altered, as though someone or something had edited my memories. Late one stormy night, I sat huddled on my couch when I heard a soft, almost inaudible whisper calling my name. I froze, straining to listen, but the sound came again from the darkened hallway. With trembling hands, I grabbed a flashlight and ventured out, only to find the corridor empty except for a puddle of water on the floor, as if someone had just stepped through. In that moment, the realization hit me with paralyzing clarity. I wasn't just experiencing random glitches. The changes in my environment were part of a larger, unexplainable phenomenon, one that I felt was slowly enveloping me. I reached out to a few acquaintances, hoping they might confirm what I was experiencing, but their responses were always the same, dismissive, attributing my observations to stress or an overactive imagination. I began to doubt my own perceptions, wondering if I had somehow fallen prey to a waking nightmare of my own making. But every time I looked around, the evidence of the changes was undeniable. Now, as I write these words in the dim light of my apartment, every creak of the floorboards and every flicker of the light bulb fills me with dread. I am left questioning whether the shifting objects, the inexplicable notes, and the mysterious marks are mere coincidences born from a fraying mind, or if there is something far more sinister at work. The feeling of being watched persists, a constant reminder that I may not be alone, and that my reality might be manipulated by forces I cannot see or comprehend. I've come to realize that I might never find the answers I seek. The more I try to piece together the puzzle, the more it seems that my environment, and perhaps my very existence, is part of an elaborate, unexplainable system. I no longer know what is real, and I fear that the phenomenon I'm experiencing is only the beginning of something much larger and far more terrifying. Whether it's a trick of my own perception or a genuine intrusion into my life, the mystery remains, leaving me trapped in a state of perpetual unease. Every day, I wake up to a slightly different world, and I am haunted by the possibility that I am caught in a loop of reality that is constantly shifting, manipulated by forces beyond my control. I moved into my new apartment on a crisp October morning, excited for a fresh start in a place that promised simplicity and quiet. The building was old, with creaky floors and dim hallways, but it had a charm that drew me in. The apartment itself was modest, a small one-bedroom with large windows that let in plenty of light. I spent the first day unpacking and arranging my few belongings, setting up a comfortable space that felt entirely my own. Everything was as expected. The sofa was in the living room, my desk by the window, and my favorite painting hung over the mantel. A week later, after settling into a routine, I returned home from work feeling unusually tired. As I unlocked the door, I noticed something odd. The hallway was exactly as it had been the day before, yet when I stepped inside, I realized that the small, patterned rug near the door had moved slightly. I remembered leaving it neatly centered, but now it was shifted a few inches to the right. I dismissed it as my own absent-mindedness and fixed it back in place, assuming I must have misremembered its original position. The next morning, I left for work as usual. When I returned that evening, I felt a strange sense of déjà vu. I sat down with a cup of tea in my living room and began scrolling through my phone when I noticed a faint message written in what looked like chalk on the wall near the window. Remember? The message wasn't there before. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, certain I must be imagining things. Still a chill ran down my spine. I wiped it off, hoping to erase the unsettling reminder, and tried to convince myself it was nothing more than a random coincidence. Over the following days, the changes became subtler but more persistent. The bookshelf that I had arranged in a specific order, by color, then by height, was found in a different configuration one evening. A book I distinctly remembered placing at the far end was now in the center. The living room lamp, which I always turned off before leaving, was occasionally on when I returned, as if someone had flicked the switch in my absence. At first, I thought my memory was failing me. Maybe I was simply tired from the long days at work. But soon, the glitches escalated. One afternoon, while I was preparing dinner, I glanced over at the dining table. My favorite vase, a small ceramic piece that had been a gift from my mother, was no longer on its usual spot. Instead, it sat atop the bookshelf, among the novels and old photographs. I swear I left it on the table last night. I retraced my steps in the apartment, but there was no sign of anyone. No open door, no misplaced object that could explain its relocation. I felt as though I was being pranked by an unseen hand, yet no one would be foolish enough to invade my personal space. Then, one evening, I found a handwritten note on my kitchen counter. It was written in a neat, unfamiliar script. Don't trust the mirror. I stared at it, heart pounding, and wondered if I had somehow missed an intruder. I checked every window and door, but nothing seemed amiss. The note disappeared the next day without a trace, as if it had never been there. I started to feel isolated in my own home, questioning whether these strange occurrences were real or if I was simply losing my mind. The situation reached a tipping point when I began noticing that the changes weren't limited to physical objects. On multiple occasions, I found myself having conversations with friends and family, only to realize later that the details of those discussions were different from what I recalled. A neighbor, who usually greeted me with a warm smile, suddenly acted as if he didn't know me at all. I overheard fragments of familiar voices repeating words that I was sure I had never said, as if the very fabric of my memories was being rewritten. Late one night, unable to sleep, I wandered into the hallway. The dim lighting revealed that every door in the corridor was slightly ajar, more than I remembered from the day I moved in. A pattern emerged, a subtle shift in the alignment of door frames, a slight misplacement of a light switch, as if the apartment was being reconfigured piece by piece. I found myself drawn to the mirror hanging in the hallway. Normally, it reflected a straightforward image of the corridor, but tonight, its surface seemed to ripple, distorting the scene in front of me. For a moment, I saw a flash of something that wasn't there, a figure standing behind me, its features blurred and undefined. I spun around, but nothing was there. I was alone, yet the echo of that impossible presence haunted me. Every morning now, I wake up with a lingering sense of disorientation. I meticulously check every corner of my apartment, only to find that while everything appears normal at first glance, there are minute details that are different. A picture frame turned a fraction of a degree, a coffee mug relocated, or a smudge on the wall where there was none before. The repetition of these small changes has become so routine that I've begun to track them in a journal, desperately trying to pinpoint a pattern. But the entries seem to contradict one another, as if time itself is rearranging my experiences. One particularly eerie evening, I sat in the living room staring blankly at the unchanged scene. The familiar couch, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the same view of the city through the window. And yet deep down, I knew that something was off. I felt an overwhelming sense that I was trapped in a closed loop, caught in a reality that was continuously shifting without my consent. The subtle alterations weren't random accidents or the product of my overactive imagination. They were systematic, deliberate edits to the world around me. In that moment, I confronted a horrifying possibility: that I wasn't simply experiencing isolated glitches, but that my entire reality might be a facade, a carefully constructed illusion that was being rewritten in real time. The idea that everything I had known was mutable, that the foundation of my existence was nothing more than a series of programmed events, left me paralyzed with dread. I wondered if I had unwittingly stepped into an alternate version of my life, one where every detail could be altered without warning, and where I was nothing more than a character in an elaborate simulation. Now, as I sit here in the dim light of my apartment, the silence around me feels oppressive. I have no idea if I will ever return to the way things once were, or if the ever-changing environment is a one-way ticket into an endless loop of distortion and unreality. The more I search for answers, the more I fear that I have become entangled in a system beyond my control, a glitch in the matrix of my own life. And as I ponder this unsettling truth, I can't help but wonder, does it even matter if reality is fake or programmed, when every moment I live is dictated by forces I can neither understand nor escape? When I first moved into the small apartment on Maple Street, everything felt ordinary. I had just left a hectic city life behind for a quieter existence. The building was old but well-maintained, with creaky wooden floors and narrow hallways that echoed with the sounds of everyday life. I thought nothing of the occasional groan of the structure settling at night. I assumed the odd flicker of streetlights was merely an electrical quirk. It wasn't until the second week that I began noticing subtle anomalies defying rational explanation. At first, it was the unnerving feeling of being watched. I would return home from a late shift only to sense a presence lingering in the dim corridor, though no one was ever there. I chalked it up to nerves and the building's age. Then came the whispers, faint, indecipherable murmurs emanating from the walls in the pre-dawn hours. I recorded them on my phone, expecting to find a logical explanation upon playback, but all I heard was static mixed with an almost imperceptible voice, as if pleading in a language just beyond my grasp. Determined to uncover the truth, I started a meticulous log. Every creak, every unexplained sound, and every flicker of movement in the shadows was documented. I even installed a small security camera in the common hallway, hoping to catch evidence of an intruder. One night, reviewing the footage, I witnessed something I couldn't rationalize. A pale, fleeting figure drifting silently down the hall. Translucent and ghost-like, it vanished as soon as it appeared. I sent the clip to a friend specializing in video forensics, but he could only offer vague comments about unusual artifacts in the image. As days turned into weeks, the events escalated. My door would be found slightly ajar in the morning, even though I was meticulous about locking it at night. Objects in my apartment inexplicably shifted. A mug turned upside down on the kitchen table, a book left open on the floor in the hallway, even my keys subtly rearranged in their bowl. One evening, the hallway light flickered in a rhythmic pattern that seemed almost intentional, as if trying to communicate. I reached out to my neighbors to see if anyone else had experienced these oddities. Some dismissed my concerns as overactive imagination. Others offered only anxious glances and whispered, "It happens." Then, on a stormy night, I answered a knock at my door to find a small package on my stoop with no return address. Inside lay an old black and white photograph of the apartment building taken decades ago, accompanied by a handwritten note on the back. "You shouldn't have come back." My heart pounded as I studied the image. The building appeared vibrant, bustling with life. Yet in every shadow lurked an indistinct, menacing presence. The cryptic handwriting only deepened the mystery. Desperate for answers, I delved into local archives at the nearby library. I learned that the building had been constructed in the early 1900s and had once belonged to a reclusive family rumored to have dabbled in occult practices. Local lore spoke of unexplained disappearances and whispered curses attached to these very walls. A yellow journal in the archives recounted secret gatherings in a sealed-off room, where participants claimed to commune with forces beyond the mortal realm. Every new fact I uncovered raised further unsettling questions. Who or what was responsible for these disturbances? Could the disembodied whispers and shifting objects be remnants of a tragic past, or something far more sinister? In the weeks that followed, the line between waking life and nightmare began to blur. I found myself lying awake at odd hours, straining to catch fragments of voices that drifted through the silence. On several mornings, I awoke to discover my bedside table inexplicably turned or personal items misplaced as though rifled through. At times, a sudden drop in temperature made my breath visible even on warm nights. Rational explanations began to crumble under the weight of mounting evidence. I even sought counsel from a psychologist friend who attributed my experiences to stress and isolation. Yet the physical proof, the recordings, the grainy video, the mysterious photograph, and cryptic notes slipped under my door, could not be so easily dismissed. One rainy afternoon, while scouring old newspapers for any mention of the building's past, I stumbled upon a report of a fire in the early 1940s that had claimed the life of a young girl. The article mentioned that her spirit was said to wander the halls, mourning a loss that could never be remedied. I couldn't help but wonder if the sudden cold drafts, the eerie lights, and that ghostly figure captured on camera were connected to her tragic fate. In a desperate bid for peace, I left small tokens, a candle, a faded photograph, a single rose at the base of the stairs, hoping to appease whatever restless soul roamed these corridors. Despite every effort, the presence only grew stronger. I began receiving cryptic notes, written in a spidery script reminiscent of the handwriting on the old photograph. Brief messages such as "remember" or "return" hinted at a connection between me and the building's haunted legacy. Each note deepened my dread, making me question whether my pursuit of truth was drawing me into a cycle of events set in motion long before I arrived. Now, as I write these words in the quiet darkness of a late autumn night, I am caught between logic and the unexplainable. I sit by my window watching rain trace rivulets down the glass, each drop a silent witness to my unraveling sanity. My recordings continue to accumulate, each file a puzzle piece in a picture growing ever more fragmented. I've attempted to share my findings online, only to be met with skeptical laughter or anxious silence. The building's secrets remain fiercely guarded, as if some force is determined to keep them hidden. I am left with one relentless, burning question. What force resides within these walls, and what does it truly want from me? Every night, as shadows lengthen and the whispers return, I feel that I have only scratched the surface of a mystery that might be far larger and darker than mere coincidence. There is no resolution in sight, only the endless pursuit of elusive truths. Each unanswered knock and every unexplained sound drives me deeper into a labyrinth where the line between the rational and the supernatural dissolves, leaving me to wonder if some doors, once opened, can never be closed. I was leaving work late on a cold November evening when I first encountered him. The city streets were nearly deserted, bathed in the amber glow of streetlights and the occasional flicker of neon signs. I had just stepped out of the building when a solitary figure emerged from the shadows of an alley. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in a worn leather jacket and a hat pulled low over his eyes. At first, I thought nothing of it. Just another homeless man seeking shelter from the biting wind. But there was something about his gaze that made me uneasy. His eyes were too intense, scanning the street as if he were looking for someone, or perhaps something. I continued walking briskly, trying to shake the feeling of being followed. The man didn't appear to move immediately, but I couldn't shake the sensation that he was a few steps behind me, always lurking just at the edge of my vision. Every time I glanced back, he was gone. Yet, when I reached a busier intersection, I caught a glimpse of him standing in the crowd, his eyes fixed on me with an unsettling mix of curiosity and malice. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my ears. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that I was overreacting. Still, the hairs on my neck prickled with warning. The next day, I found a note slipped under my door. It was written in spidery handwriting, the words barely legible. I see you. I felt a chill run down my spine. At work, I noticed subtle changes in my routine. Colleagues, who usually greeted me warmly, offered only terse nods, as if they sensed something amiss. During lunch, I overheard snippets of conversation about a strange man seen lurking near the office building, his presence inexplicably tied to unsettling incidents that had been occurring recently. I couldn't help but wonder if that was the same person I'd encountered the previous night. Over the following days, the encounters grew more disturbing. I would catch sight of him in unexpected places. At the bus stop, waiting under a flickering street lamp, even reflected in the window of a passing car. His presence seemed to permeate every aspect of my life. I began receiving unsettling phone calls, silence on the other end, broken only by low, indistinct breathing. Once, while walking home from a late dinner, I heard him murmur my name softly from the darkness behind a row of parked cars. I froze in place, dread surging through me as I realized he knew more about me than he should. I tried to tell myself it was all a series of coincidences, random encounters that were no more than urban legend come to life. But the evidence was impossible to ignore. I started researching local news stories and discovered reports of similar encounters. People speaking of a mysterious stranger who seemed to appear at moments of vulnerability, leaving them with an overwhelming sense of dread. Some said he was a vagrant, others whispered of something far more sinister. I began to notice that the more I talked about it, the more others insisted they had never seen anyone matching his description. It was as if my memory was the only one that held onto the truth. One night, I found myself in a particularly dark part of town, desperate to outrun the pervasive feeling of being watched. I ducked into a small diner, the bright neon sign offering a temporary refuge from the gloom outside. But as I sat there, huddled in a booth with shaking hands, I caught a glimpse of him through the window, standing just outside, his face partially illuminated by the streetlight. His eyes met mine for a fleeting second, and in that moment I felt a surge of terror, so overwhelming that I couldn't breathe. I left the diner in a daze, not daring to look back. I rushed home, the image of his haunting gaze seared into my mind. I can't trust anyone anymore, I thought. I began to question whether these bizarre encounters were a result of a shared delusion or if, in fact, I was the target of something malevolent and very real. Late at night, I scour the internet for similar experiences, combing through forums and message boards. I stumble upon countless stories from strangers, each one eerily echoing my own tale. A mysterious figure, a relentless pursuit, and the inexplicable silence of those who claim to have seen him. Some users even go so far as to suggest that this man is not a single individual at all, but a harbinger, a sign of darker times to come. The more I read, the more my mind is flooded with terror and uncertainty. Is he an omen of something far worse, a dark force that chooses its victims arbitrarily, or simply a twisted criminal who thrives on fear? I have taken every precaution since then, yet every shadow seems to whisper his name. I sometimes see his silhouette in the reflection of a storefront window, or hear his footsteps echo behind me on empty streets. I've altered my life completely. No more late nights, no more solitary walks. But no matter how much I try to protect myself, the feeling of being pursued remains constant, a low hum of dread that I can never quite shake. Every night, before I close my eyes, I scan the dark corners of my room, half expecting to see that chilling pair of eyes staring back at me. And sometimes, in the silence of my sleep, I can almost hear him whisper, "I see you." I realize now that my encounter was not a random, isolated incident, but part of something far more insidious. It haunts me to think that there are others out there, living in the same unknowing terror, being watched by this faceless menace. I don't know if I'll ever find a rational explanation for what happened that night, or why he chose to target me. All I know is that the memory of his intense gaze and the palpable aura of menace that surrounded him have left an indelible mark on my soul. I live with the constant fear that at any moment, in any place, he could reappear, unannounced and unrelenting. Even now, as I write this account, I can't shake the feeling that I am still being observed. The corners of my vision often betray me with fleeting glimpses of movement, and the sensation of being followed is an ever-present burden. The terror of that night has transformed my life, leaving me questioning every shadow, every stranger's glance, every unexplained sound. I wonder if this is a fate that awaits anyone who catches the eye of that enigmatic figure, a fate marked by a life of perpetual fear and solitude. I share this story not to invite pity, but to warn you. If you ever sense that inexplicable chill down your spine, or see a stranger whose gaze lingers a moment too long, heed your instincts. Your life might depend on it, because the man I encountered is not bound by time or place, and his presence may be far more widespread than any of us dare to believe. I am still haunted by his presence, and every time I close my eyes, I feel that he is waiting for me. I can't help but wonder if our paths will cross again, and if so, what fate will befall me. The mystery of his identity and his intentions remains unsolved, and I am left with a chilling realization. In a world that seems safe by day, darkness hides secrets that may never be revealed. Beware the stranger who watches from the shadows. You never know when he might decide that you are next. In the dead of night, when silence reigns, I recall that cold encounter with crystal clarity. The memory of his hollow gaze and the deliberate pacing of his slow, measured steps echo in my mind, as if they were etched in time. Each time I pass by a dimly lit street or an abandoned building, I am reminded that the shadow of that figure looms large. It is as if the very fabric of reality has been warped by his presence, leaving me to wonder if I am living in a parallel world where fear is not merely an emotion, but a constant companion. I have come to realize that some encounters are not meant to be forgotten, for they serve as harbingers of a truth too unsettling to ignore. Even now, I live in a state of heightened alert, always questioning the faces that pass me by, ever vigilant for that one unsettling look that signals danger. I leave this account as both a confession and a cautionary tale. In a world teeming with unknown perils, the most innocuous encounter can sometimes reveal a sinister undercurrent, a glimpse into a darker reality that lurks just beneath the surface of everyday life. Should you ever find yourself under the eerie glow of a street lamp, with a nagging feeling that you are not alone, remember that you might be treading the same path I once did. And if you hear the soft murmur of your name whispered from the darkness, do not hesitate. Flee, for your life may depend on it. I moved into my new apartment on a cool autumn day, excited for a fresh start in a place that promised peace and routine. The building was old but charming, with creaking floors and a lingering smell of dust mixed with memories. At first, everything seemed perfectly normal. My furniture arranged just as I had left it from the moving truck, the same familiar knickknacks on the shelves, even the faded wallpaper in the hallway that I had chosen because it reminded me of simpler times. But after a few days, I began to notice small discrepancies that made me question whether I was imagining things. It started with the placement of my favorite armchair. I distinctly remembered positioning it in the living room near the window so that I could watch the sunset. Yet one evening I found it pushed slightly further from the window, almost as if someone had nudged it while I was out. I brushed it off as my own forgetfulness and reset it, but the unease lingered. The next morning, on my way to work, I passed the small courtyard behind the building. In its usual state, the courtyard was overgrown with weeds and scattered with old benches. Today, however, one of the benches was replaced by a brand new one, painted a fresh shade of green that clashed with the aged brick and neglected flowers. I stopped in my tracks, certain that nothing had changed when I left, yet here it was, an anomaly that I couldn't explain. At work, the oddities continued. I noticed that my coworker Mark, who I had known for years as someone who rarely smiled, greeted me with an unusually warm, almost overly friendly "Good morning" that struck me as odd because I had never seen him in such high spirits before. Later, in the break room, a notice on the bulletin board announced a change in the lunch schedule, a schedule that had been set the same way for as long as anyone could remember. When I asked a few colleagues about it, they simply shrugged and said they hadn't noticed anything different. It was as if I was the only one aware of these subtle shifts. Returning home became a source of mounting anxiety. Every evening, I scrutinized my apartment for signs of change. One night, I found a series of faint scratches along the baseboard in the living room, like the marks of tiny claws. I couldn't recall any pets, nor had I seen any intruders. Then, one day, I discovered a handwritten note taped to my refrigerator door. The note read, "You're not alone," in a script that wasn't mine. I felt a chill run down my spine as I frantically looked around, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows of my own home. When I brought it up with a friend over the phone, she insisted that I must be mistaken, that I probably left it there during a moment of absent-mindedness. But I knew I hadn't. As days turned into weeks, these irregularities became more frequent and disturbing. I began to notice that objects in my apartment seemed to move on their own. A book I had left on my bedside table would be found on the kitchen counter, and the curtains, which I always kept drawn at night, were sometimes partially open when I returned from work. I started keeping a detailed journal, noting the time, the location, and every minute change I could observe. Yet each time I reviewed my entries, I felt a growing disconnect from the reality I once knew. It was as if I were living in two worlds at once. One that everyone else inhabited, unchanged and oblivious, and another that I alone experienced, a world in which every day the familiar turned foreign. The situation reached a climax one dreary evening when I came home from work and found my living room completely different. The furniture was arranged in a layout that I had never used, a different angle for the sofa, the coffee table placed where the bookshelf had always been, and the window curtains drawn to a side I couldn't recall choosing. In the mirror hanging above the fireplace, I caught a glimpse of myself standing in a position that didn't match my memory. I tried to speak to my neighbors about it, but they all insisted that nothing had changed, that the building looked exactly as it always had. Their dismissive responses only deepened my isolation, leaving me to question my own sanity. Late that night, unable to sleep, I sat in the darkened living room and stared at the clock, watching the seconds tick by in a monotonous rhythm that seemed to mock my growing fear. I began to feel that the changes were not random, but deliberate, as if some unknown force was slowly rewriting my reality piece by piece. I felt trapped in a world that was continuously shifting beneath my feet, a world that everyone else experienced as normal while I was left to bear the burden of its unraveling. Now, as I write these words by the flickering light of a bedside lamp, I can't help but feel that I've been marked by this phenomenon. My memories are no longer reliable, and every familiar object in my life carries the potential for unexpected transformation. I am alone in this realization. Everyone around me seems blissfully unaware of the subtle distortions that have invaded my existence. I fear that I may never return to the comforting normalcy I once knew, that I am trapped in a closed loop of shifting details and unexplainable changes, locked in a reality that is both alien and hostile. And as the night deepens, I am left with one terrifying question. Am I the only one who sees the cracks in this carefully constructed world? Or is there something far more sinister behind these ever-changing signs? Something that will never let me go back to the life I once believed was real? I moved into the aging apartment on the outskirts of town with a mix of excitement and trepidation, unaware that the building held secrets older than its cracked brick walls. My first night was uneventful. A few creaks in the hallways, the whisper of wind through poorly sealed windows. But in the quiet hours, I began to sense something off. It started with a subtle tapping at my door, a soft, rhythmic sound coming not from outside, but seemingly from within the walls themselves. I dismissed it as old pipes or settling wood, yet each night the sound grew more insistent, almost deliberate, as if it were counting down to something I could not name. As days turned into restless nights, oddities began to manifest in inexplicable ways. Shadows in the corridor lingered long after I'd passed, and in the mirror I caught fleeting glimpses of a figure standing just behind me, a dark, indistinct silhouette that vanished when I turned around. I tried to convince myself that exhaustion was blurring the edges of my perception, but the persistent chill that accompanied these moments left a residue of dread in my bones. My sleep became fragmented, haunted by dreams of whispering voices and unseen hands trailing along my skin, until I started to document every unnerving detail. One evening, while sifting through the clutter in a cramped storage closet, I uncovered a faded, leather-bound journal hidden beneath a stack of old newspapers. Its brittle pages chronicled the experiences of a previous tenant, recounting disembodied voices that echoed through empty corridors and spectral shapes that drifted at the edges of sight. One entry, scrawled in a trembling hand, described a presence that seemed to feed on fear, growing bolder with every secret murmured in the dark. Reading those words sent shivers down my spine, and for a long while, I felt as if the journal's author were reaching out to warn me, or perhaps to share in my fate. Sleep remained a distant memory as nights were tormented by unearthly sounds and an almost tangible hum of a presence lurking just beyond perception. I began recording these incidents, convinced that if I could capture evidence, I might find a rational explanation. But the more I observed, the more reality warped into something unrecognizable. One night, while lying in bed, I distinctly heard my name whispered from the shadowed corner of the room, a voice low, almost inaudible, yet filled with an ancient malice. The following morning, deep scratch marks were discovered etched into the wooden floor near my bed, patterns that defied any natural explanation and hinted at the deliberate work of unseen hands. The terror escalated when everyday objects started moving on their own. A favorite mug would inexplicably appear on the kitchen counter at odd hours, and curtains would ripple, though no breeze stirred the stagnant air. My attempts at logical explanations crumbled when a hidden camera I installed in the living room captured a moment of sheer dread. A shadow, too defined to be mere darkness, gliding silently past the lens and pausing for an impossibly long heartbeat before disappearing. Playback of the footage made the very air thicken, leaving me uncertain if I had witnessed a trick of light or something decidedly supernatural. One particularly harrowing night, the apartment was plunged into an unnatural stillness. In the dead of night, I awoke to slow, deliberate footsteps echoing down the corridor. I lay frozen, heart hammering, as my door creaked open to reveal only impenetrable darkness beyond. In that suffocating moment, I felt an oppressive presence fill the room, its gaze piercing deep into my mind. I tried to scream, but my voice was caught in a strangled silence, as though some ancient force had stolen my ability to call for help. It was then that I understood this force was not bound by mortal constraints. It had been waiting, lurking patiently, for someone to unwittingly invite it in. Over the subsequent weeks, the manifestations grew ever bolder. I began hearing echoes of mocking laughter in empty rooms, a sound both sorrowful and scornful. Sometimes, in the pre-dawn hours, I would glimpse a door that I was certain had been locked, now ajar and revealing a narrow corridor I had never seen before. In that passage, the walls appeared to breathe, pulsating with an unearthly rhythm that defied explanation. My efforts to leave the apartment only deepened my isolation, as though the building itself had claimed me, refusing to release its unwilling guest. I reached out to neighbors, but they dismissed my accounts as overactive imagination fueled by an old structure's natural quirks. Their skepticism only fanned the flames of my terror. Desperation drove me to comb through local archives, and I discovered that the apartment complex had been built on the grounds of an abandoned asylum, a place rumored to have witnessed dark experiments and unspeakable atrocities. Rumors whispered that the anguished souls of the damned still roamed the grounds, their unrest permeating every stone. Each new detail confirmed my worst fears. I was living in a nexus of horror where the line between the living and the dead had been irrevocably blurred. Late one stormy evening, as lightning carved sinister shadows across my walls, I heard a faint lullaby drifting from the far end of the hall. Its melody, haunting and achingly familiar, lured me toward a door I'd never noticed before, a door that vibrated with a strange, irresistible energy. Hesitantly, I turned the handle and entered a small, dim room cluttered with relics of a bygone era. In its center sat an antique music box, its lid opening and closing in time with a melancholy tune. The moment I picked it up, a profound silence enveloped me, a silence that carried the weight of a long-forgotten sorrow. I have no definitive explanation for the events that have befallen me. Each night ushers in new horrors. A whisper in an empty room, a shadow that defies natural laws, or a cold, unseen touch that leaves my skin crawling with dread. I document these experiences not in hope of finding solace, but as a record for anyone who might one day piece together the mystery of this place. I fear that if I stop, the malevolent force might reclaim my voice and erase the truth from memory. Even now, as I write these words with trembling hands in the feeble glow of a flickering lamp, I sense eyes, ancient, unseeing, watching me from the darkness. As I bring this account to a close, I cannot help but feel that I am merely scratching the surface of a horror far greater than I ever imagined. The whispers in the dark, the inexplicable movements, and the palpable sense of dread all point to an ancient malice lurking in the interstices of time and memory. Whether born of unspeakable human cruelty or emerging from a void beyond our understanding remains unknown. Yet its presence is undeniable and relentless. Even now, I sense its approach in the quiet pauses between my shallow breaths, a promise of inevitable despair. I leave you with this final thought. Be wary of the places where history has left its scars, for the past is never truly silent, and the echoes of what once was maybe waiting, patient and unseen, to claim you as their own. I don't know when it started. That's the scariest part. There wasn't a clear moment when I could say this is where things changed. It was slow, like a dream bleeding into reality, so gradual that I didn't realize what was happening until I was too deep in it. At first, it was little things, misplaced items, gaps in conversations, moments where I swore I had done something only to be told I hadn't. I'd be certain I sent a message, only to check my phone and find nothing there. Or I'd remember eating lunch, but the dishes would still be clean in the sink. I blamed stress, overwork, bad sleep, but then time started slipping. I would blink and hours would be gone. I'd check the clock and see 9:45 a.m., then look again moments later to find it was past noon. My phone had calls I didn't remember making. My browser history showed searches I would never type. I tried to tell myself I was just distracted, that maybe I was just zoning out. But then it got worse. One morning, I woke up on the couch instead of my bed. I never sleep on the couch. I tried to remember going there, but my last memory was brushing my teeth and getting under my blanket. My shoes were at the front door, slightly wet, as if I had gone outside during the night. But my keys were still in their usual spot. The door was locked. It didn't make sense. I started keeping a notebook. Every hour, I wrote down what I was doing. It was a stupid system, but I thought if I could track my own life, I'd notice when things went missing. The first few days were fine. The timestamps lined up. My notes made sense. Then, on the fourth day, I opened the notebook and saw something that wasn't mine. In the space where I should have written about eating dinner, there was a line scrawled in unfamiliar handwriting. You are not supposed to remember. I stared at it for a long time. My hands started shaking. I tore out the page, burned it in the sink, and tried to tell myself I had written it somehow, that I was losing it, that this was just exhaustion playing tricks on me. Then other people started acting wrong. My coworker, Jen, greeted me in the morning with a huge smile, asking how my weekend had been. I told her it was fine, the usual, but she gave me a weird look. You were at my place last night, she said, laughing. Are you messing with me? I felt my stomach drop. What? She rolled her eyes. You literally sat on my couch for like 3 hours. You left at midnight. I didn't go to her place. I know I didn't. I was in bed all night. I was sure of it. But the way she said it, so casual, so certain, made me feel like my own memories weren't real. Then, one day, I caught myself saying something I didn't mean to say. I was at a grocery store checkout when the cashier asked how my day was going. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words that came out weren't mine. They don't want me to talk about it. I hadn't meant to say that. It was like my mouth moved on its own. The cashier blinked, clearly confused, and I stammered out a quick laugh, brushing it off. But as I grabbed my bags and left, I heard her mumble, "Not another one." I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't want to know. I started leaving notes for myself before bed. Simple things. You are in control. You are awake. You are real. But every morning, the notes would be gone. Not crumpled. Not in the trash. Just gone. And then last night, I woke up standing in my kitchen. My hands were on the counter, gripping the edge like I was holding myself up. My feet were freezing against the tile. The clock on the stove read 3:33 a.m. I had no idea how I got there. I tried to move, but for a long moment, my body wouldn't respond. I just stood there, paralyzed, staring at my own reflection in the dark window. And then, slowly, I smiled. I felt my face move, stretching into a grin, but it wasn't me doing it. It was like watching a stranger control my own body. My hands twitched, my breath hitched in my throat. My reflection, my own face, was staring at me like I was the one who didn't belong. Then I blinked, and I was back in bed. It's morning now. I don't remember getting here. My hands are still cold. My feet are dirty like I had been walking outside. I checked my phone, and there's a message in my sent folder from last night that I don't remember writing. It was sent at 3:34 a.m. It says, "I'm still here." I don't know who I sent it to, but the scariest part? There's already a reply. Not for long. I first met him on a rainy Tuesday evening when I returned from a late shift at the hospital. I just moved into a modest apartment in a quiet part of town, a place I hoped would offer some respite after years of relentless city life. As I fumbled with my keys at the door, a soft knock startled me. I opened the door to find a man standing in the dim hallway, water dripping from his worn leather jacket. He introduced himself as Daniel, a new neighbor who just moved into the apartment next door. His smile was friendly, his tone warm and unassuming, and for a moment, I let my guard down. A few polite words passed between us, and I welcomed him to the building. At that time, nothing about the encounter felt out of place. Over the following weeks, Daniel's presence became a constant, albeit unobtrusive, feature of my daily life. He would often be seen in the hallway, occasionally pausing to chat about mundane things. The weather, a local coffee shop's new blend, even the best route to the grocery store. Initially, I appreciated the casual neighborly interactions. Yet, there was something subtly unsettling in the way he asked questions. It began with harmless queries. "Do you usually work night shifts?" Or, "I noticed you leave your door unlocked sometimes. Aren't you worried?" His tone was gentle, but his curiosity felt oddly invasive. I dismissed it as the quirk of someone trying too hard to be friendly, but a small voice in my head whispered that something wasn't quite right. As the days passed, Daniel's questions grew more personal. One evening, while we were both waiting in the lobby for the elevator, he asked, "You live here alone, right? No family around?" I nodded cautiously, feeling an inexplicable chill despite the building's warm lighting. Later, I overheard him complimenting my taste in decor from across the hall, a compliment so detailed it made me wonder if he'd spent time watching me arrange my living room. At first, I chalked it up to genuine interest, but the compliments became a little too precise, a little too measured. I began to notice that whenever I stepped out, I'd catch sight of him lingering just a few steps behind, always at a distance that made it impossible to tell if he was simply coincidental or deliberately tracking my movements. One morning, I left for work, locking the door with my usual routine. When I returned that evening, I found a small note slipped under my door. In neat handwriting, it read, "I noticed your keys were misplaced today. I thought you'd appreciate knowing." My heart pounded as I stared at the note. It wasn't threatening in tone, but it confirmed my growing suspicion that Daniel's benign facade masked a deeper, more unsettling intent. That same week, I caught him on the building's security camera peering through my living room window, a brief, inexplicable glimpse that left me frozen in disbelief. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that my privacy had been violated. The situation escalated in small, alarming increments. One evening, as I returned home after a particularly exhausting shift, I found the curtains in my living room drawn tightly closed despite my habit of leaving them slightly open. When I asked the building manager if anyone had been in my apartment, he hesitated before assuring me nothing was amiss. But deep down, I knew that Daniel had mentioned something about how he preferred to admire the world from the shadows rather than the glaring sun. His philosophy, he explained in a hushed tone during one of our hallway chats, was that true beauty lies in the details most people choose to overlook. At the time, I laughed it off as eccentricity, but the memory of that conversation now made my skin crawl. One particularly stormy night, when the rain pounded relentlessly against my window, I decided to leave my apartment for a walk to clear my head. As I trudged along the slick sidewalks, I noticed a figure trailing me, a silhouette that mirrored my every step under the flickering streetlights. When I finally dared to glance back, there he was, Daniel, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses even in the rain, a slight, almost imperceptible smirk on his lips. My pulse surged, and I quickened my pace, desperately wishing to lose him in the maze of wet, empty streets. But no matter how many turns I took, he remained just at the periphery, his presence both unnerving and inexplicable. At work, my colleagues noticed my agitation and asked if everything was all right. I recounted the unsettling encounters with Daniel, expecting sympathy and concern. Instead, they exchanged awkward glances and murmured that he'd been in the building for only a few days, hardly enough time to develop such a connection with any resident. One coworker even suggested that perhaps I was reading too much into harmless neighborly behavior. But the evidence was all around me. The persistent questions, the misplaced note, the inexplicable appearances. I started to feel like a character in a horror movie, where the antagonist's actions were so subtle that they blurred the line between normalcy and menace. Then came the night that solidified my worst fears. I was working late in my apartment when I heard a soft knock at my door. Hesitant and with a racing heart, I peered through the peephole and saw Daniel's familiar face, illuminated by the flickering hallway light. "I just wanted to check if you were okay," he said, his voice calm and disarming. Something in his expression, a hint of something unspoken, a look that didn't quite match the words, made my skin crawl. I muttered a polite excuse and shut the door, bolting it behind me. That night, sleep eluded me as I lay in the dark, haunted by the sound of his footsteps echoing faintly down the hall, as if he were pacing outside my sanctuary. I've since taken measures to protect myself, changing locks, installing extra cameras, even considering a move, but the feeling of being watched never dissipates. Every time I catch a glimpse of someone in a dark jacket or hear a voice that mimics Daniel's unervingly soft tone, my mind races back to that night and the unsettling intensity in his eyes. The line between friendly concern and controlling obsession has blurred beyond recognition, leaving me to wonder if I'm simply overreacting or if there's a genuine threat lurking in the guise of neighborly kindness. Now, as I sit in the quiet of my apartment, I can't help but question whether all these events are mere coincidences magnified by my own anxiety, or if they are the deliberate acts of a man whose true nature remains shrouded in ambiguity. Daniel could be anywhere, in the corridors of this building, on the dimly lit streets outside, or even watching from afar through unseen eyes. His behavior leaves me with one lingering, unsettling thought. Am I just a paranoid victim of my own overactive imagination, or have I truly encountered someone dangerous who blurs the boundary between concern and control? The question remains unanswered, haunting me with every creak of the floorboards and every unexpected knock at the door. I thought the beginning was nothing more than the normal inconvenience of a busy life, misplacing my keys on a hectic morning, only to find them tucked away in an unexpected spot. That morning, I was late for work, frantic and disoriented. I rummaged through every drawer and pocket, but my keys were nowhere to be found. After a brief panic, I retraced my steps and discovered them on the kitchen table, exactly where I had left them the night before. I brushed it off as simple forgetfulness, but a strange feeling lingered, as though something had shifted ever so slightly in my daily routine. Over the next few days, minor oddities began to accumulate. A coffee cup that I had set by the window one evening was later found shattered on the floor, despite no signs of forced entry or tampering. At work, I overheard colleagues discussing events that I clearly remembered happening differently. During lunch, I mentioned a recent conversation with a friend, only to have a co-worker reply as if that conversation had never taken place. Their blank expressions and furtive glances left me unsettled, making me wonder if I was losing my memory or if something else was at work. It was during one of these unsettling moments that I first noticed something far more disturbing. I was leaving the office when I passed by a small convenience store, and a woman, whom I was certain I had seen there before, greeted me by name. "Good morning, Charlie," she said, her voice warm yet oddly unfamiliar. I hesitated and asked, "Have we met before?" She smiled enigmatically and replied, "We've always known each other." The encounter left me questioning my own recollections. Had I somehow forgotten people I once knew well, or was reality quietly shifting around me? That evening, while returning home, I began to notice that familiar street signs and landmarks seemed to change ever so slightly, as if rearranged by an unseen hand. The lamppost outside my apartment window, which had always been a fixed point of reference, now bore a different number, one I had never seen before. I stopped, staring at the sign, trying to recall if I had ever noticed the change, but my memory betrayed me. It was as if the alteration had been inserted into my timeline without my awareness. Days turned into weeks, and the strange coincidences only grew. I would leave a note on my desk, and later find it inexplicably folded in a drawer, its handwriting altered ever so slightly. Conversations with friends became puzzles of missing details. When I mentioned that I had seen an old acquaintance at the grocery store, they responded with confusion, insisting I had never spoken of such a meeting. One evening, after a particularly bizarre day, I looked in the mirror and nearly didn't recognize the person staring back at me. My reflection, normally so vivid, appeared blurred and distant, as if I were a stranger in my own skin. It wasn't just objects and conversations. Even people themselves began to change. At the local diner, I recognized a couple I'd seen countless times. Yet when I attempted to recall details of our past encounters, their faces were blank slates, their eyes devoid of recognition. I confronted them, asking if they remembered a conversation we'd shared, but they laughed it off, claiming I must be mistaken. Their dismissive reactions and altered demeanors left me questioning the fabric of reality. Had I been removed from the narrative of my own life, or was I witnessing something far more sinister? Late one night, I sat alone in my living room, poring over old photographs and journal entries, desperate for some sense of continuity. I found a picture of me and my childhood friend at a local park, a memory I had cherished for years. Yet, as I examined the photo, I noticed subtle differences in the background, a tree that hadn't been there before and shadows that seemed to shift when I looked away. I began to document every detail, every anomaly, but the more I wrote, the more uncertain I became. Was I truly the observer, or had I become nothing more than a passenger on a train speeding toward an unknown destination? Each day, my sense of isolation deepened. I began to feel that I was living in a world where the rules were constantly rewritten, where the line between memory and reality blurred into a confusing haze. My friends and family continued their routines, seemingly unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the discrepancies that plagued my every step. I tried to speak with them about it, but they brushed aside my concerns as trivial or imagined. The more I tried to assert control over my own narrative, the more it seemed to slip away, leaving me an impotent bystander in a story that was no longer mine. One cold evening, as the wind howled outside my window and the streetlights flickered ominously, I received a call from an unknown number. When I answered, a voice whispered, "You're not supposed to remember." I couldn't tell if it was a prank, a hallucination, or something else entirely. The line went dead almost immediately, leaving me staring at the phone in disbelief. Was this a warning, or just another anomaly in a series of inexplicable events? Now, as I write these words, I am haunted by the disintegration of my own reality. Each morning, I wake with a nagging sense that something essential has been removed from my life, a page torn from the narrative I once trusted. I no longer know whether to trust the solidity of the world around me. Every familiar object, every conversation, now hints at a reality that is both ordinary and disturbingly alien. I have started to avoid making plans or confiding in others, fearing that shared memories might be erased by the next inexplicable occurrence. Even my own reflection seems to flicker, caught between two realities, leaving me to wonder if I have become a mere observer in a story that unfolds without my consent. I continue to document these events, desperate to find a pattern or a clue, yet each entry only deepens the mystery. Am I simply losing my grip on sanity, or is there a greater force at work, rewriting my existence one day at a time? The uncertainty gnaws at me relentlessly, leaving me stranded in a limbo where past, present, and future intertwine in ways that defy logic. As I sit here, pen trembling in hand, I cannot shake the haunting possibility that I may soon be nothing more than a peripheral character in a narrative controlled by an unseen hand. I am left with more questions than answers, and the unsettling fear that perhaps everything I experience is not my own. Whether this is all in my head or orchestrated by something far beyond my understanding remains an open, terrifying question. I moved into my new apartment on a bright September morning, expecting the usual mix of excitement and nervous anticipation that accompanies a fresh start. Everything seemed ordinary at first. The slightly creaky floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, even the odd flicker of a street light outside. It was the kind of place everyone might consider charming if they overlooked its age and occasional quirks. But as the days passed, I began to notice small, inexplicable details that made me question whether my surroundings were as normal as I had believed. At first, the incidents were harmless, almost amusing. A book I had left on the coffee table would vanish by morning, only to reappear on the windowsill by noon. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway when I was alone, and once, I distinctly heard laughter coming from an empty room. I told myself these were coincidences, the product of an overactive imagination fueled by the stress of moving. I even joked with friends about the mysterious happenings, confident that rational explanations would eventually surface. Yet, as weeks turned into months, the anomalies accumulated, growing too frequent to ignore. I began to see people on the street who looked eerily familiar. A woman in a red coat I'd never met, who seemed to follow my gaze with knowing eyes, or a man who smiled at me, as if we shared a secret history. I caught fleeting glimpses of these figures in reflections that vanished before I could register their features. The occurrences extended to sounds as well, whispers that mimicked voices from my past, or a soft, haunting melody echoing from a room that should have been silent. Determined to find logic in the chaos, I installed cameras around the apartment and scrutinized every recorded moment, only to find inexplicable gaps and blurry figures that defied analysis. I kept a meticulous journal, noting times, dates, and even the precise position of misplaced objects. Neighbors assured me my apartment was ordinary and that any disturbances were likely due to its age, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was at work. One particularly disquieting night, I sat alone in the dim light of my living room when I heard a soft, almost imperceptible voice whisper my name. I froze, heart pounding, as the sound echoed from different corners of the room. I rationalized it as the creaking of pipes and the settling of an old house, but a lingering doubt gnawed at me. Had I misinterpreted ambient noises? Or was someone, or something, trying to communicate with me? The turning point came on a rainy evening when I returned home to find my apartment rearranged. Furniture was slightly shifted, and in the center of the room lay a single, unopened envelope addressed to me in handwriting I did not recognize. Inside was a small folded note that read, "Remember who you are." For days, I lived in a haze of paranoia, unable to decide whether I was being pranked or if I'd slipped into an alternate reality where my memories and identity were questioned. Soon, I began doubting my own sanity. Was I simply succumbing to stress and fatigue, letting my mind fabricate scenarios in an environment ripe with suggestion? Or was there truly something inexplicable at play? Each night, as I lay in bed, I tried convincing myself that rational explanations were enough. Yet the more I reasoned, the more reality seemed to fragment, like a puzzle with missing or misplaced pieces. In the dead silence of one night, I sat at my desk reviewing the evidence I'd collected. Camera footage, journal entries, strange sounds, all painting a picture of a world where the line between reality and imagination blurred. My fingers trembled as I documented these events, unsure if I was recording actual occurrences or the ramblings of a mind on the brink of collapse. Every memory, every sensation became suspect. Was I a character in a story beyond my control? Now, as I write these words, I am haunted by more questions than answers. I still encounter odd occurrences, doors that open on their own, fleeting shadows at the edge of my vision, and that persistent hum that refuses to fade. I document everything, hoping one day to piece together a coherent explanation. Yet each observation makes me question if reality itself is slipping away. Have I been touched by something otherworldly, or am I merely losing my grip on sanity? In the weeks that followed, I grew increasingly isolated. Friends expressed concern over my erratic behavior, though none had witnessed the inexplicable events dominating my days. At times, I felt trapped in a dream, where every familiar object harbored a secret and every sound carried hidden meaning. I even avoided well-lit areas, seeking refuge in corners where shadows whispered and danced, as the constant uncertainty eroded my trust in even the simplest sensations. I once confided in my closest friend, Mark, recounting the misplaced items, eerie voices, and the mysterious envelope. Mark listened with concern and suggested that stress and anxiety might be distorting my perception, that the old house could be playing tricks on me. His reassurances, though comforting, did little to dispel the tangible evidence of events that felt too deliberate to be mere hallucinations. Late one night, after a sleepless vigil analyzing the footage, I discovered a new anomaly. In a brief, grainy clip, a figure appeared in the window's reflection. A figure strikingly reminiscent of my late grandmother, whose memory still haunted me. The image was fleeting, almost dismissible as a trick of light, yet multiple replays confirmed its presence. Could the boundaries between life and death be thinning, allowing fragments of lost souls to seep into my reality? Or was this yet another fabrication of a mind desperate for familiarity in a rapidly shifting world? Every discovery intensified the internal conflict. I oscillated between disbelief and terror, trapped in a relentless cycle of questioning my sanity. My once safe apartment had become a labyrinth of uncertainty, with each corridor hiding secrets that threatened to unravel my grasp on reality. I began to wonder if these experiences were isolated incidents or part of a larger, more sinister design, a puzzle with no clear solution. As I conclude this account, I remain engulfed in perpetual ambiguity. I continue to document the unexplained, even as I question whether these events are real or figments of a mind unraveling in solitude. The unanswered questions haunt me daily. Am I witnessing something supernatural? Or is it simply my imagination running wild? I may never understand what is happening, or if it ever happened at all.